Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty intense, actually. We're looking at Chapter 9 of Split to Survive, the Case for a Divided Israel.
Yeah.
And our focus, as requested, is really on the practical side of things. Borders, diplomacy, what the future might look like for this proposed state of Dan and Kingdom of Judah. I mean, the source envisions this split because of these really deep cultural, ideological differences, right? And this chapter gets into the nitty-gritty of how the authors think it could actually, work day to day.
Exactly. It's less about the why and much more about the how. How do you manage this separation once it's happened? Especially when the premise is that one state, Dan, is pretty wary of the other, Judah. Very wary, in fact.
Okay, let's dive right in then. Starting with the border. It jumps out immediately that Dan isn't planning on friendly handshakes across the line. The security level they're proposing is, it's pretty staggering.
It really is. The authors work from this assumption that Dan thinks Judah sees it as, I don't know, an escaped asset, like something that needs to be recaptured. And that view, that potential hostility, it fuels this need for, frankly, a highly militarized border. They talk about a 200-kilometer electrified fence. That alone is huge. Plus watchtowers, thermal cameras, and then in the Jezreel Valley, which is key strategically, they mention layered defenses, even drone swarms.
Drone swarms.
Yeah, it's a vision of a border that's not just marking territory, it's actively designed to repel. I mean, the scale of the investment they're suggesting and the sheer distrust it implies,
Yeah.
it's significant.
It's definitely more than just a fence, and the rules for who gets to cross this thing sound just as intense, especially going into Dan.
Oh, absolutely. Very deliberate asymmetry there. The idea is that Dan's citizens can leave freely, sure. But coming in, totally different story. They outline these biometric checkpoints designed to handle like 10,000 crossings a day, which is a lot. But crucially, with built-in AI threat detection. So it's not just about flow, it's screening, filtering.
So what if you're, say, a tourist wanting to visit Dan, or someone from Judah?
Right. For tourists, it's surprisingly strict according to this source. A 48-hour visa, okay, but with a $5,000 bond.
$5,000.
Yeah, that's a hefty bond. It really signals, maybe discouraging casual visits or maybe just a strong financial deterrent against overstaying. And for Judah citizens, even tougher, a 30-day permit, but only after what they call rigorous vetting. It suggests this deep concern about security risks, maybe about people not fitting Dan's secular model. Makes you wonder about, well, family connections, business ties.
It really does. It paints this picture of a state absolutely determined to control who comes in. And it sounds like they're expecting trouble from within, too. Sabotage attempts.
Precisely. Yeah, the chapter covers that, countering sabotage. They propose an intelligence agency modeled on the Shin Bet using AI to track agents from Judah. That's quite forward-looking.
Yeah.
And get this hardening critical infrastructure, like power grids, water lines, using blockchain security.
Blockchain for infrastructure security.
Interesting. Yeah, it shows they're thinking about digital threats as much as physical ones, but the question remains, how effective can that really be against a determined state actor, if it came to that?
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Diplomacy. The description you used is cold peace, hot vigilance. It doesn't exactly scream friendly relations.
No, not at all. The core assumption driving Dan's whole diplomatic approach, as laid out here, is that Judah will remain a rival, maybe even one that ultimately wants to sort of reabsorb Dan. So the posture has to be caution, constant vigilance. They don't seem to expect any real warmth or trust to develop.
So given that tension, what kind of diplomatic structures do they actually propose? How do they manage this?
Well, they suggest a few key things. First, a UN non-aggression treaty. Okay, standard enough. But critically, one backed by automatic trade embargoes if it's violated. So relying on international bodies and economic muscle.
Putting a lot of faith in the UN there.
Seems like it. Second, really minimal and controlled trade. Just essentials. They mention Galilee water, Leviathan gas maybe, and secured using smart contracts. Again, using tech to try and bridge that trust gap.
Right. Technology as a mediator.
Exactly. And finally, tiny, heavily surveilled embassies. Dan would have one in Jerusalem's secular enclave, Judah, in Tel Aviv. It's all very transactional, almost adversarial, really, not your usual diplomatic setup.
It sounds incredibly fragile.
Yeah.
What kind of challenges do the authors see in keeping this kind of hostile peace going?
They point specifically to Judah probably wanting access to Dan's resources, primarily its skilled people, engineers, tech workers, and its tax base. Dan's envisioned as the economic powerhouse here, so that economic desire could fuel friction, maybe attempts to pressure or coerce Dan, and Dan's strategy, as proposed, respond with sanctions, lean on international pressure. It's a constant standoff, basically. Makes you wonder how long that could realistically last without, boiling over.
Yeah, it does.
Okay, let's talk about who Dan does want to let in. Their immigration policy. The chapter title, No Room for Parasites. That's pretty blunt.
It is stark, isn't it? It sets the tone immediately. The authors envision an incredibly selective policy. They want people who will be contributors, basically, net positives for Dan's economy and society. They even use the analogy of a kibbutz admission committee vetting people rigorously for shared values and ability to contribute. It's definitely not an open-door policy. It's about carefully curating a population.
And who's making these decisions? Who's on this committee?
They propose a screening committee, quite a name, made up of people with strategic backgrounds, so ex-IDF strategists are mentioned, plus economists, psychologists, people looking at skills, mindset, the whole package. And the criteria are tough. High-demand skills tech, medicine. Significant assets, they actually state $100,000. And crucially, taking a secular oath.
A secular oath, wow. And the rejection rate. They anticipate rejecting 90%. 90. That just shows how exclusive they intend the state of Dan to be. You have to ask, what are the long-term consequences of such a limited pool of immigrants? On dynamism, on growth.
It's incredibly strict. What's the actual process like if you do apply?
It sounds grueling.
Yeah.
A 3-month background check, comprehensive, polygraph tests, lie detectors, in-depth interviews. And the authors stress rejection would be swift. If you don't fit, you're out. Deported quickly. No ambiguity.
And it doesn't stop once you're potentially in, right? There are rules for marriage, visas too.
Absolutely. Control seems paramount. If someone from Dan marries someone from Judah, there's this proposed 2-year surveillance period for the spouse from Judah, checking for radical ties, and if they find anything, exile. For both of them.
For both.
That's what the source suggests, yeah. And with Horus, we mentioned the tight visa, the bond, but also overstay. You're on an eternal blacklist, banned forever. It all points to this deep, deep anxiety about maintaining the specific social and political character they want for Dan.
Okay, one last point on movement. Illegal immigration. With a border that tight, some people will try to cross illegally. How does Dan handle that in this scenario?
The approach described is, well, it's harsh. They propose a desert detention camp. Undocumented immigrants would have to work for basic food and shelter. The conditions are explicitly meant to be a deterrent. Plus, weekly deportation flights back to Judah. Just routine removal. It's all about dissuasion and swift expulsion.
Okay, moving inside Dan now. Security within the state itself. It sounds like they're particularly focused on their own citizens who might return from Judah. Why that extra scrutiny?
Yeah, that's a key point. The concern, as presented in the source, is hostile influence. Given the ideological chasm and the expected antagonism from Judah, there's this fear that returning citizens might have been, well, influenced, radicalized maybe, or even turned into agents. It's about protecting Dan's internal stability from what they see as external threats, even if carried by their own people.
So how do they propose screening these returning citizens?
They detail something called a debriefing protocol, conducted by, get this, former Mossad interrogators.
That's Mossad.
Yeah.
Wow.
These interrogators would analyze the returnees' social media, contacts, the behavior while they were in Judah, trying to gauge any shifts. And for anyone deemed high risk, especially if they had ties to, say, religious figures in Judah, there's a proposed 14-day mandatory quarantine.
Quarantine.
Yeah, isolation, along with lie detector tests during that period, and the consequences for actual sabotage. The authors are blunt. Severe punishment. They mention death or worse, which is chilling. It shows the perceived stakes.
Very high stakes indeed. The chapter also mentions torn families. What are the implications there? That sounds heartbreaking.
It really does. It refers to people who might have close relatives, spouses, parents, children on the other side of this new hard border. And the authors really emphasize the potential gulf in lifestyles. They contrast Dan, where they imagine women driving, voting, full participants in a secular society, with Judah. Judah is portrayed as potentially much more restrictive, possibly even using surveillance, like CCTV, to monitor things like immodesty. Imagine having family embrace one path while you're on the other. It could create incredibly painful personal choices and, yes, potentially tear families apart.
Let's look at how Dan plans to keep itself stable, economically and socially. Sounds like their secularism and economy are seen as key defenses.
Absolutely. They're presented as core assets. To shield the economy, they propose economic shields. The The big one is something called Dancoin, a gold-backed, blockchain-secured digital currency. The idea is stability, an alternative to Judah's shekel, which they imply might be unstable.
Interesting. A state-backed crypto.
Sort of, yeah, but gold-backed for stability. And trade policy reinforces this shield, like 70% of trade projected with the West, maybe only 10% with Judah. And the tariffs on that small amount of Judah trade earmarked directly to fund Dan's defense budget. So trade itself becomes part of the security apparatus.
And socially, how did they guard their secular identity?
They talk about a social fortress, basically guaranteeing no religious police, no forced prayer, none of the theocratic elements they anticipate in Judah, preserving the secular lifestyle, explicitly citing Tel Aviv as the model. And education is key here too, a heavy focus on STEM, science, tech, engineering, math, prioritizing progress, innovation over what they frame as religious dogma. It's about actively shaping the culture.
So finally, the chapter looks ahead, future prospects. And it sounds like they see completely different paths opening up for Dan and Judah.
Massively different, a stark contrast. For Dan, the outlook presented is very optimistic. They project a $100 billion GDP by 2030, fueled by tech, trade with NATO and the EU, a transparent democracy, maybe even using AI for governance. Very modern, very Western-oriented.
And for Judah.
The picture painted is grim. A theocracy, explicitly compared to Jewish Iran. Restrictive laws, leading potentially to international isolation, economic decline, maybe becoming reliant on non-Western powers. It's a vision of two entities born from one, but heading in completely opposite directions.
The chapter wraps up with a section called Dan's Stand, which sort of pulls it all together.
Yes, it really reiterates the core argument from Dan's perspective as imagined by the authors, the belief that Judah will want to reclaim Dan. Therefore, all these measures, the intense border security, the constant vigilance, the highly selective policies, they aren't just options, they're essential. Absolutely crucial for Dan's survival, for its freedom. The final line essentially says, this is the price of a free future for Dan.
So wrapping up this deep dive into Chapter 9 of Split to Survive, we've really walked through these incredibly detailed plans, border walls and AI screening.
The cold peace diplomacy.
Right, the super strict immigration, the internal security focus.
And those radically diverging futures envisioned for Dan and Judah.
It just highlights the immense practical hurdles, doesn't it? And that profound lack of trust that seems to underpin the whole idea of this separation in the source.
It really does. This chapter forces you, the reader, to grapple with the sheer complexity. What would it actually take to draw this line, to maintain it? And are these two paths they describe truly plausible outcomes?
It definitely leaves you thinking about the feasibility, the human cost, the long-term consequences, and it certainly makes a case for engaging with a full Split to Survive document if you want to understand the author's complete vision. Thanks for joining me to unpack this really challenging, thought-provoking material.